My name is Maggie Devereaux, and 11 months ago, at my mother-in-law's 60th birthday dinner, my sister-in-law stood up with a glass of Moscato in her hand and told 22 people that I married her brother for his trust fund. She didn't whisper it. She didn't hint at it over coffee, the way people usually do when they want to ruin you quietly. She stood at the head of a rented table at Bellamy's Steakhouse, tapped her fork against her glass until the room went silent, and said, "I just think it's time somebody said what we're all thinking. Derek didn't fall in love. He got picked. Maggie saw the Wallace name, saw the house in Rye, and she made her move." My husband's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. His mother's face went the particular shade of pale that comes right before someone starts crying at a party. And I sat there in a navy dress I'd bought for this exact dinner, feeling my own heartbeat in my ears, doing the thing I always do when I'm ambushed, going very, very still. Here's what nobody at that table knew, including, I'd guess, half of you watching this right now. I make more money than my husband. I made more money than him the day we met. I made more money than his entire family combined that year, and I have the direct deposit stubs to prove it. I'm a senior actuarial consultant. I spent 9 years clawing my way through exams that have a first attempt pass rate of about 40%, working 80-hour weeks while my friends were out living their 20s. And by the time I was 31, I was clearing just under $310,000 a year. Derek, who I love, who is kind and funny and terrible with money in the most harmless way, Derek was a high school history teacher making $61,000 a year when we got married. So when Christine Wallace-Brute stood up in front of his aunts, his cousins, his father's old law partner, and told the room I'd married Derek for his money, I almost laughed. Almost. Except nobody laughs when their whole face is burning and every eye in the room has turned to look at them like they're a stain that just appeared on the tablecloth. Quick question, actually, and I promise I'll get back to the story, but where are you watching this from tonight? Drop it in the comments. I'm always curious whether it's morning where you are or you're winding down after a long day, because honestly, this story took me almost a year to be ready to tell, and I like knowing who's on the other side of it. Okay, back to Bellamy's Steakhouse. I want you to understand something about the Wallace family before I go further, because none of what happens later makes sense without it. From the outside, they look like old money. There's a portrait of Derek's grandfather in the front hallway of his parents' house, oil on canvas, hung under a little brass picture light like he's in a museum. They have a place in Rye, New York that's been in the family since the 50s. Derek's father, Holt Wallace, spent 30 years as a partner at a mid-sized insurance firm and retired with what everyone assumed was a very comfortable cushion. But old money and looking like old money are two very different things, and I would spend the next several months learning exactly how different. Christine is Derek's older sister by 4 years. She's a real estate agent in Westchester, married to a man named Grant Pruitt who does something in commercial lending that nobody in the family fully understands or asks about. Christine has always run a little hot, competitive with her brothers, protective of her parents, quick to decide who's family and who's in the family. I'd been in the family for exactly 3 years and 4 months on the night she decided out loud that I wasn't. After the toast, there was that specific kind of silence you only get at family events. The silence where everyone is furiously deciding whether to say something or pretend they didn't hear it. Derek's mother, Isabel, recovered first. She laughed this bright, brittle laugh and said, "Christine, honestly, sit down, you've had 2 glasses of wine," and the table sort of exhaled and moved on to cutting into their steaks like nothing had happened. Except it had happened. And I knew, sitting there with my napkin balled in my lap, that this wasn't the kind of thing that gets forgotten. This was the kind of thing that gets repeated at every holiday from now until one of us dies. Derek drove us home that night without saying much. I remember the specific quiet of the car, the streetlights sliding across his face in that rhythm you only notice when you're trying very hard not to cry in front of someone. About 10 minutes from our apartment, he finally said, "I'm sorry, I don't know what's gotten into her." "Do you believe her?" I asked. I hated how small my voice sounded. "Of course not," he said, too fast, the way people say things when they're trying to convince themselves as much as you. "I want to tell you I let it go that night." I didn't. I lay awake until almost 3 in the morning, running numbers in my head like I do when I can't sleep. Our joint account, our separate accounts, the mortgage on our place in Nyack that I paid 70% of every month. The wedding that my parents and I had covered almost entirely because the Wallaces, despite the portrait and the house in Rye, had quietly explained that this year had been tight. That should have told me something. It didn't, not yet. I was still thinking about this as an insult to my character. I had no idea yet that it was actually the first loose thread of something much bigger, something involving a trust fund that wasn't supposed to exist anymore, a signature that wasn't Derek's, and a version of the Wallace family finances that none of us, including apparently Holt Wallace himself, fully understood. That comes later. First, I need to tell you what happened 3 weeks after that dinner when Christine's joke stopped being a toast at a birthday party and started being a campaign. 3 weeks after the birthday dinner, my mother-in-law's book club friend Deborah, whom I had met exactly twice, sent me a friend request on Facebook. I almost didn't accept it. I'm glad I did, because it's how I found out what was actually being said about me when I wasn't in the room. Christine had a private group chat with about 6 women from the extended family and family-adjacent circle, cousins and Aunt Deborah. A woman named Patris, who I later learned was Isabel's hairdresser and somehow also considered family. Somebody in that chat, I still don't know who, took a screenshot and sent it to Deborah's daughter, who was friends with a girl I went to grad school with, who sent it to me with the caption, "I think you need to see this." Small world. Terrible, gossiping, small world. The screenshot showed Christine writing, "I've done the math. Derek makes $61,000. Their mortgage alone is $2,900 a month. Rent on that apartment before they bought was $2,400. Explain to me how a teacher affords that lifestyle without family money propping it up." I'm not saying she's evil. I'm saying open your eyes. Do you see what she did there? She never said the word gold digger. She said, "Explain to me." She framed herself as the reasonable one just asking questions, the one person willing to say what everybody else was too polite to say. It's a very effective way to spread a rumor because it doesn't sound like gossip. It sounds like concern. The problem, the enormous, glaring problem, was that Christine had done exactly 0% of the actual math. She knew Derek's salary because he'd mentioned it once at Thanksgiving. She had no idea what I made because I don't talk about money at family dinners. I never have. It's not a secret I was hiding out of shame. It's a habit from growing up with a father who lost his logistics company in the 2009 crash and spent years afterward wincing every time money came up at the table. I learned early that talking about what you earn in front of people who are struggling is its own kind of cruelty, so I just didn't. Which meant that for 3 years, Christine Wallace-Brute had been quietly constructing a story about me using a single data point, my husband's salary, while having no idea that mine covered the mortgage, the car payments, both of our health insurance premiums after his school's plan turned out to be garbage, and the $22,000 we put into a joint retirement account the year before. I didn't say anything to Christine directly, not yet. I made a decision that night, sitting on the edge of our bed with my phone still open to that screenshot, and the decision was this. I was not going to defend myself with words. Words hadn't worked at Bellamy's. Isabel's "sit down, you've had 2 glasses of wine" hadn't worked either. It just told Christine that nobody was going to stop her. I was going to defend myself with documents. If Christine wanted to do math, I was going to give her math, real math. And I was going to make sure it happened in a room she couldn't laugh her way out of. But here's the thing about revenge stories, the honest thing that doesn't always make it into these videos. I didn't get to plan this on my own timeline. Life doesn't wait for you to be ready. For days after I saw that screenshot, Derek came home from his mother's house looking like someone had knocked the air out of him, and he sat down across from me at our kitchen table and said, "Maggie, I need you to look at something. I think my dad's in trouble." That's when the story stopped being about me. Here's what happened. Derek had gone to his parents' house to help his father, Holt, sort through boxes in the garage. Holt was downsizing. A word that in retrospect should have set off alarm bells for all of us, because people with genuinely comfortable finances don't usually need to downsize a house they've owned outright for 22 years. In one of the boxes, mixed in with old tax returns and a stack of Derek's childhood report cards, Derek found a folder labeled Devereux Wallace Trust Est 2019. He didn't recognize the name. Neither did I when he showed me, and I do this for a living. A trust with our married name on it, dated 3 years before we were even engaged, made no sense. Inside the folder was a single-page summary from a wealth management firm in White Plains, Ashford Kellerman Advisors, describing a trust valued as of its creation date, at $440,000, funded by Holt and Isabel Wallace, with the stated purpose of supporting the education and future stability of Wallace family descendants. Derek was listed as a beneficiary. So oddly was Christine's oldest daughter, my niece Poppy, who was 6. I was not listed as a beneficiary in 2019, obviously, since Derek and I hadn't even started dating yet. But there, at the bottom of the page, in a section titled Recent Amendments, was a note dated 14 months ago, 5 months before our wedding, stating that the trust had been amended to include spouse of primary beneficiary upon legal marriage, meaning me. I sat with that document for a long time. Derek watched me read it twice. I didn't know this existed, he said. My dad's never mentioned a trust, not once, not even when we were stressed about the wedding costs. That last part stuck with me more than anything else on the page. If there was $440,000 sitting in a trust with Derek's name on it, why had his parents told us 5 months before the wedding that this year had been tight, and let my parents and me absorb almost the entire cost? I want to be very clear about something here because I think it's important for this kind of story to stay honest instead of turning into a cartoon. I did not in that moment think Derek's parents were villains. My first thought wasn't they're hiding money from us. My first thought was that trusts are complicated, that maybe this was earmarked for something specific, a house down payment, a future grandchild's college fund, and that there was probably a boring, reasonable explanation. I called Ashford Kellerman Advisors the next morning on my lunch break, using my own professional credentials to at least get someone to confirm the trust existed, since Derek, as a listed beneficiary, was legally entitled to basic information about it. The woman I spoke with, a client associate named Renata, was polite but careful in the way people get when they sense they're standing near something they shouldn't say out loud. I can confirm there is an active trust under that name, she said. For specific balance and disbursement information, you'll need to speak with the trustee directly or come in with your husband and photo ID since he's a named beneficiary. Who's the trustee? I asked. There was a pause. The trustee of record is Christine Wallace-Brute. I remember exactly where I was standing when she said that, in the stairwell of my office building, because the reception was better than in my office, holding my phone so tight my knuckles ached. Not Holt, not Isabel. Christine, who 3.5 weeks earlier had stood up at a birthday dinner and accused me of marrying her brother for the family's money, was the person legally in control of a $440,000 trust that her own brother didn't know existed. I didn't tell Derek that part right away. I know how that sounds, like I was hiding something from my own husband, but I want you to understand my thinking because I think it matters. Derek is close to his sister. Not blindly loyal, but close. In the specific way siblings who grew up sharing a bunk bed during summers at the Rye house are close. I had a piece of information that was going to detonate something in his family, and I didn't want to hand it to him with nothing else, no context, no second source, nothing but my word against hers. I've watched enough families fracture over half-finished accusations to know that if I was going to say something this serious, I needed to be right, and I needed to be able to prove it. So I did what I do best. I started building a file. Over the next 2 weeks, I turned into the kind of person I usually only am at work, methodical, quiet, keeping a running document that nobody else could see. I want to walk you through what I found because the details matter here. This isn't a story about a vague sense that something was off. It's a story about specific numbers that stopped adding up the moment you actually looked at them. First, the trust itself. Using the summary document Derek had found, plus a follow-up call where Renata, the client associate, confirmed she was permitted to send Derek a basic beneficiary statement since he was, again, legally entitled to one, we got the full picture. The trust had been funded in 2019 with $440,000. As of the most recent quarterly statement, dated 7 weeks before that birthday dinner at Bellamy's, the balance was $118,000. $322,000 had left that account over 5 years, and neither Derek nor his mother, based on a very careful conversation Derek had with her a few days later, had any idea where it had gone. Second, Holt's downsizing. I did something I probably shouldn't have, technically, though nothing illegal. I have professional access to public property and lien records as part of my actual job, since part of what I do involves assessing risk exposure tied to real estate holdings for corporate clients. I ran a basic public records search on the Rye property. What I found was that 18 months earlier, Holt and Isabel had taken out a home equity line of credit for $175,000. 6 months after that, they'd taken out a second one for an additional $90,000. Both loans were still outstanding. A couple who supposedly had a $440,000 trust sitting untouched, who own their house outright, do not typically need to borrow $265,000 against that house in the same 18-month period. Third, and this is the one that made my stomach turn, I looked at Christine and Grant's finances, or as much as I could piece together from public information plus things Derek mentioned offhand once I started gently asking questions. Grant's commercial lending job, the one nobody in the family fully understood, had actually ended 14 months earlier. Not changed jobs. Ended. There'd been a small item in a local business journal about layoffs at his firm that I found by searching his name and the company together, dated right around the time the trust amendment adding me as a beneficiary had been made. 14 months ago, right when Grant lost his job, right when $322,000 started disappearing from a trust that Christine controlled. I remember sitting at my kitchen table at 11 at night with all of this laid out in a spreadsheet, and feeling this strange mixture of vindication and dread. Vindication, because it was becoming very clear that whatever financial pressure was actually happening in this family, it had nothing to do with me. And dread, because I now understood exactly why Christine had stood up at that dinner and pointed the finger somewhere else. If you're the one quietly draining a family trust to cover your husband's job loss, and you're worried your brother is eventually going to ask hard questions about where $400,000 went, one of the smartest things you can do, even if you don't consciously think of it this way, is make sure the family's suspicion is already pointed at someone else. Someone new, someone who married in, someone it's socially easy to distrust. I wasn't just an insult that night at Bellamy's. I think now I was a decoy. But I want to be fair here because this story only works if I'm honest about the uncertainty I was sitting in. I didn't have proof yet that Christine had taken the money for herself. I had a trust that had lost money, a job that had quietly ended, and a timeline that lined up in a way that made my skin crawl. That's suspicion. That's not evidence. And I've made mistakes before in my life by being certain of something before I had the right to be. So instead of confronting anyone, I did something that I think surprised even me. I called a lawyer. Her name was Priya Anand, a trusts and estates attorney a colleague had recommended 2 years earlier when Derek and I were drafting our own wills. I sat in her office on a Tuesday afternoon, laid out everything I had, and asked her one question. As a beneficiary's spouse, what am I actually allowed to do here? Her answer changed the entire shape of the next 4 months. Priya listened to the whole thing without interrupting, which I appreciated, because by the time I finished I'd basically given her a 40-minute financial thriller. Okay, she said, tapping her pen against a legal pad covered in her own shorthand. A few things. First, you personally have almost no legal standing here. You're not the beneficiary, Derek is. So whatever happens next has to happen through him, not around him. That stung a little, honestly, even though I knew she was right. I'd spent 2 weeks quietly building this case like it was mine to solve, and she was telling me gently that it wasn't. Second, she continued, a trustee has a fiduciary duty to the beneficiaries. That's not optional, that's not a favor, it's a legal obligation. If Christine has been distributing trust funds to herself or her household without proper authorization under the trust's terms, that's not a family disagreement. That's a potential breach of fiduciary duty. And depending on the amount and intent, it could be a much bigger problem than that. How much bigger? I'm not going to speculate on criminal exposure without seeing the actual trust document and the distribution records, she said, which I respected. She wasn't going to sensationalize this to make me feel better. But I will say this, $322,000 is not a rounding error. If there's no paper trail showing proper authorization for those disbursements, someone is going to have serious questions to answer. So what do I do? You don't do anything yet, Priya said. Derek does. He needs to formally request a full accounting from the trustee. As a named beneficiary, he's entitled to that under New York law. It's called the right to information. And a trustee who stonewalls a beneficiary's reasonable request for an accounting is, frankly, telling on themselves. I remember driving home that evening rehearsing how I was going to say all of this to Derek. Not your sister is a thief. Not even, I think your sister is a thief. Just the facts laid out the way Priya had laid them out for me, calm, sourced, careful. Derek was quiet for a long time after I finished. Longer than I expected. He got up, poured himself a glass of water he didn't drink, and finally said, I need you to understand something. If this is nothing, if there's some explanation, I need you to be okay with dropping it and never bringing it up to my family again. But if this is real, he trailed off and I watched something harden in his face that I don't think I'd ever seen before. If this is real, I need to know, because she stood up in front of everyone and used you as a shield. And I let her. That was the moment I understood this wasn't just my fight to defend my own reputation anymore. It had become something Derek needed to see through too, for his own reasons, and I think that mattered not because I needed his permission, but because a betrayal like this lands so much harder when it comes from someone you trusted your whole life, and he deserved to walk into that with his eyes open on his own terms. He sent the formal written request for an accounting to Ashford Kellerman advisors the following Monday, with Priya CC'd, using language Priya had helped him draft. It was polite. It was procedural. It gave Christine, as trustee, 30 days to respond with a full record of distributions. Christine called him 4 hours after that letter went out. Not the wealth management firm, Christine, directly, having apparently heard about it within the hour, which told us something on its own about how closely she was monitoring that account. Derek put the call on speaker without telling her I was in the room. I'm not proud of that particular deception, but I also don't regret it, because what came out of Christine's mouth in that call is the reason this story has the ending it does. Derek, what is this? Christine said, her voice already climbing. No hello. A lawyer letter to me? Do you understand how insane that is? I'm your sister. I just want to see the accounting, Chris, Derek said. His voice was steadier than I expected. That's all. It's a completely normal thing to ask a trustee for. It's insulting, is what it is. Do you have any idea what I've been doing for this family? Do you have any idea what I've been carrying? So tell me, Derek said. What have you been carrying? There was a long pause on the line. I remember watching Derek's face, watching him grip the edge of the counter, and I remember thinking, this is it. This is the moment she either tells the truth or digs in. She dug in at first. You know what this is about her, isn't it? Christine said, and I felt my whole body go cold because I knew exactly who her was. She's been in your ear since the birthday dinner. She's turning you against your own family over one comment I made after 2 glasses of wine. This isn't about Maggie, Derek said. This is about $322,000 that isn't in a trust that's supposed to have my name on it. Explain that to me and I'll drop the whole thing. The silence that followed lasted, I'd guess, about 8 seconds. It felt like 8 minutes. You don't understand what's been happening, Christine finally said, and her voice had changed completely, smaller, cracking at the edges. Grant lost his job 14 months ago. He didn't tell anyone. He didn't tell me for almost 6 weeks, Derek, because he was so ashamed, and by the time he told me, we were already 2 months behind on the mortgage and Poppy's tuition deposit was due, and I panicked. I panicked and I had access to that account, and I told myself it was a loan. I told myself I'd pay it back before anyone ever needed to know. I want to pause here, because this is the part of the story where I think it would be very easy to just let you hate her, and I don't think that would be honest. Christine wasn't a cartoon villain who drained a trust fund to buy herself a boat. She was a woman who watched her husband lose his job, watched her family's finances quietly collapse, and made a series of increasingly desperate decisions to keep that collapse invisible from everyone around her, including, it turned out, her own parents. That doesn't excuse what she did, it explains it. There's a difference, and I think both things can be true at once. You told everyone Maggie married me for the trust, Derek said, and his voice cracked in a way that broke something in my chest because I could hear how much this was costing him. You used her as a distraction while you were the one taking the money. I didn't plan that, Christine said, and I believed her actually in that specific moment. I didn't sit down and think, I'll blame Maggie so nobody looks at me. It came out. I've been so scared for so long and I saw an easy place to put it and I put it there. I know how that sounds, I know it's not okay. Derek didn't say anything for a long moment, then. I need the full accounting, Chris, not because I don't understand what happened with Grant. Because Mom and Dad don't know and Poppy's college fund is gone, and none of that is my decision to just quietly forgive on everyone's behalf. If you send that to the trustee firm officially, it becomes a record, Christine said, panic creeping back into her voice. Dad's going to find out everything, Mom's going to find out everything. They're going to find out either way, Derek said. The only choice you have left is whether they find out from you or from a letter. He hung up. He stood there for a second with his hand still on the counter. And then he looked at me, really looked at me, in a way that told me he needed something from me that wasn't advice or strategy, just presence. And I crossed the kitchen and put my arms around him, and we stood there for a long time without either of us saying anything at all. What happened next didn't happen the way it does in movies, with everyone gathered in one dramatic room for a single explosive confrontation. It happened slowly, painfully, over about 6 weeks, in a series of smaller conversations that each chipped away a little more of the story. Derek told his mother first, alone, over coffee at her kitchen table without me there. I think that was the right call. Isabel needed to hear it from her son, not filtered through her daughter-in-law, especially a daughter-in-law who'd been publicly accused of exactly the kind of financial opportunism that was actually happening on the other side of the family. Derek told me afterward that his mother didn't yell. She went very quiet, in a way he said he'd never seen from her before, and then she asked him to leave so she could think. It was 2 days before she called him back. When she did, she told him something none of us had known. Holt had known about some of it. Not all of it, not the full $322,000, but he'd noticed, about a year earlier, that quarterly statements from Ashford Kellerman were arriving lighter than expected, and he'd asked Christine about it. Christine had told him she was reallocating into a more conservative fund, ahead of a market downturn everyone was worried about that year, and Holt, trusting his daughter, hadn't pushed further. It was Holt's home equity lines of credit then, that had been quietly plugging the widening gap between what the family thought they had and what they actually did, money he'd borrowed against his own house without telling his wife, because he didn't want her to worry, and had told Derek and Christine this year's tight, not because it was a lie exactly, but because he didn't understand yet how not tight it was supposed to be. Everyone, it turned out, had been protecting everyone else from a version of the truth, and the sum total of all that protecting was a family financial situation that nobody actually understood, sitting on top of a rumor about me that had absolutely nothing to do with any of it. The formal accounting came back from Ashford Kellerman 4 weeks after Derek's letter. Once Christine, facing the reality that the paperwork was coming whether she cooperated or not, stopped stalling and provided records. It confirmed everything. 11 separate withdrawals over 14 months, each one authorized by Christine as trustee, totaling $322,400 routed to accounts linked to Christine and Grant. Priya was very clear with Derek and Isabel about the range of options at that point. A formal demand for repayment with a structured plan, removal of Christine as trustee, which happened almost immediately, replaced by a neutral professional trustee the family agreed on, or, if things went further, potential legal action for breach of fiduciary duty. Derek and his parents made the decision together not to pursue criminal charges. I won't pretend I didn't have complicated feelings about that. Part of me, the part that had spent weeks quietly humiliated at a birthday dinner, wanted consequences with teeth. But it wasn't my call to make, and I'd learned enough by then to know that this wasn't really my story to write the ending of. It was Derek's family, Derek's sister, Derek's decision alongside his parents. What they did decide on was a repayment plan. Christine and Grant, once Grant found new work about 5 months later, committed to repaying the trust over 8 years, with the first 18 months' progress overseen directly by Priya's firm to make sure it was real. Christine also, at Isabel's insistence, wrote Derek and me a letter, not a text, not a phone call. An actual letter, 4 pages, that she asked to read aloud to us in person before handing over. I'm not going to tell you it fixed everything. It didn't. But I want to tell you what was in it because I think it's the part of this story people usually skip. Christine read the letter to Derek and me on a Sunday afternoon in April, at a coffee shop we picked specifically because it was neutral ground, not our place, not her place, not the family house in Rye. She apologized first for the money, which I expected. What I didn't expect was how much of the letter was about the birthday dinner specifically, separate from the trust entirely. I need you both to know, she read, her voice unsteady, that what I said about Maggie at Mom's party wasn't really about Maggie at all. I've spent a year watching my own marriage quietly fall apart under money problems I was too ashamed to admit to anyone. Watching Grant shrink every single day he didn't have a job. And somewhere in there I think I needed someone else to be the problem, because if the problem was Maggie, then it wasn't me. It wasn't my house of cards. I am so sorry. You didn't do anything to deserve that, and I know an apology doesn't undo a room full of people who now have that idea sitting somewhere in the back of their heads. That last line stayed with me for a long time, because it was true in a way that nothing else in the whole ordeal had quite captured. Even after everything came out, even after Isabel personally called every single person who'd been at that dinner and told them plainly that the accusation had been false, and that the actual financial situation in the family had been Christine's doing, not mine, I still occasionally catch a flicker of it. A slightly too careful question from an aunt about how things are going with Derek's teaching salary. A cousin's spouse who still subtly treats me like I'm someone to keep an eye on. Rumors are strange that way. The retraction never travels quite as fast or as far as the original accusation did. I didn't forgive Christine in that coffee shop, not fully, not in some clean, cinematic way. What I did was tell her something I'd been sitting with for weeks, which was this: I understand why you were scared. I've watched my own family go through money falling apart, and I know what it does to people. But you didn't just protect yourself that night at Bellamy's. You used me to do it. And I need you to actually understand the difference between those two things, because I don't think you fully do yet. She cried. I didn't, which surprised me a little because I'd expected this moment to feel like some kind of release. It mostly just felt like exhaustion. Derek reached over and took my hand under the table, and I remember looking at him and thinking about something Priya had said to me, almost offhand, near the end of one of our meetings months earlier. She'd said, the money is usually the easy part to untangle, legally speaking. Spreadsheets don't lie once you get the real numbers. It's everything else, the trust between people, the version of the family everyone thought they had that takes years, not months. She was right. It's been about 7 months since that coffee shop conversation. Christine's repayments are on schedule, according to Priya's last check-in with Isabel. Grant has a new job in a different field entirely, further from finance, which I don't think is a coincidence. Isabel and Holt see a financial advisor now, a different one, unrelated to Ashford Kellerman. And Holt, for what it's worth, apologized to Derek too, for the home equity loans, for the tight year comment before our wedding, for a version of quiet, well-meaning secrecy that had let all of this metastasize as long as it did. I want to circle back to something because I think it's easy to lose track of the original insult in the middle of all this trust fund drama, and I don't want to lose it because it's the reason I'm telling this story at all. About 2 months after the birthday dinner, before the accounting came back, before the letter, before any of the resolution, I did one thing purely for myself. It wasn't strategic. It wasn't part of Priya's careful legal plan. It was petty, and I own that, and I'd do it again. Isabel had planned a smaller family gathering for Easter, the first big family event since the birthday dinner, and there was a lot of visible tension about whether I'd even come. I came. I wore the same navy dress from Bellamy's, actually on purpose, which felt significant to exactly one person at that table, which was me. At some point, over dessert, Isabel's book club friend Deborah, the same Deborah whose accidental friend request had started this whole avalanche, made a comment, clearly fishing, about how teachers really don't get paid enough these days, do they? It must be hard. I could have let it go. 6 months earlier, I would have let it go. Instead, I said very evenly, Derek's salary isn't really the household number that matters, honestly. Between the two of us, my income covers most of our expenses. I'm a senior actuarial consultant. I passed my last exam 2 years ago, which was the hard part. It's a good field if numbers are your thing. I didn't say a dollar figure, I didn't need to. I watched something shift around that table, not dramatically, nobody gasped, but I watched several people who'd spent months quietly wondering about me do the math themselves for the first time, out loud in their own heads. Deborah went a little pink and changed the subject to the ham. Derek told me later in the car that it was the first time all year he'd seen me look like myself again at one of these family things. I think that's true. I think for months I'd been so careful, so quiet, so busy building a legal case and holding my tongue and letting Priya and Derek handle things through the proper channels, that I'd forgotten I was also allowed to just say the truth out loud in a normal, unremarkable sentence at a dinner table. That's the real answer to Christine's toast, by the way, if you're waiting for some big cinematic confrontation where I list every number and watch her crumble. That's not how it went. The real answer was quieter than that. It was a trust accounting document with 11 withdrawals on it. It was a phone call where a sister finally told the truth because she ran out of places to hide. And it was one plain sentence at an Easter table that let the truth do what it does best when you finally stop protecting other people's comfort at the expense of your own. It just sat there, undeniable, and let people draw their own conclusions. I'm not going to pretend the last several months have been some neat, tidy healing arc, because that's not how families actually work, and I promised myself when I started telling this story that I'd keep it honest. Derek and Christine still talk, less than they used to, but they talk. There was a period, right after the accounting came back, of about 6 weeks where they didn't speak at all. And I watched my husband grieve something during that time that I don't think has a clean name, not quite grief for a person, since she was still alive and well 4 towns over, but grief for a version of his sister he'd believed in for 34 years that turned out to have some fault lines in it he'd never seen. I've had my own complicated moment with Isabel, too, that I haven't mentioned yet. About 3 months ago, she asked to meet me for lunch, just the two of us, which had genuinely never happened before in 3+ years of marriage. She apologized, really apologized, not the sit-down, you've had 2 glasses of wine kind, for not shutting down Christine's toast the moment it happened. I think some part of me, she said, turning her water glass in slow circles on the table, didn't want to look too closely at what Christine was implying, because looking too closely might have meant looking at things I wasn't ready to see about my own family's finances. It was easier to let the story be about you than to ask why my daughter suddenly seemed so afraid of money. I think that's probably the most honest thing anyone in that family said to me the entire year. It's easier to make the outsider the problem than to examine the cracks that were already there before the outsider ever arrived. I don't think Isabel meant to do that consciously. I don't think most families do. But it happens anyway, over and over, in families all over the place. And I think that's part of why this story resonated so much with the people I eventually told it to. Poppy's college fund, by the way, my niece, the 6-year-old, now 7, is being rebuilt. It's part of Christine's repayment structure, prioritized ahead of the general trust balance, at Grant's specific insistence once he finally understood the full scope of what had happened. He told Derek, in one of the few direct conversations they've had about it, that finding out what his job loss had indirectly caused was one of the worst weeks of his life, worse even than the layoff itself. I believe him. I think shame does strange, cascading things to people, and I've stopped needing Christine or Grant to be simple villains in order to feel like what happened to me was real and wrong. Both of those things can be true. She hurt me publicly and specifically, in a way that took actual work to undo. And she was also a person under enormous, silent pressure who made a series of increasingly bad decisions trying to protect people she loved from a truth she was too frightened to say out loud. I promised at the start of this that my own salary told a different story than the one Christine told at that dinner. And I want to actually give you that story now, plainly, because I think it matters more than the drama around it. In the 5 years before that birthday dinner, I paid in total across mortgage, both cars, both of our health premiums, retirement contributions, and general household expenses, roughly 71% of everything Derek and I spent as a household. Derek's salary as a teacher covered his own discretionary spending, half the groceries, and the full cost of a wedding gift fund he quietly put together for his own parents' 40th anniversary 2 years into our marriage. A detail I only found out about accidentally, because he never told me, because he didn't want it to feel like a transaction between us. When Priya, much later, needed a clean summary of our household finances for an unrelated matter, updating our own wills, actually. Once all of this trust business made both of us suddenly very aware of how little formal planning we'd done for our own future, I pulled 5 years of pay stubs, tax returns, and account statements into one document almost on autopilot, the way I do at work every single day for clients who are, frankly, strangers to me. I sat there afterward looking at the final number, my own 5-year gross income, sitting plainly in a cell in a spreadsheet, more than 5 times what Derek had earned in the same period. And I thought about Christine standing up with her glass of Moscato, so confident, so certain she'd caught something. She hadn't done 5 minutes of actual research. She'd looked at a teacher's salary and a nice apartment and decided the math didn't work, without ever once considering that the math simply wasn't hers to see. I've thought a lot about why that bothered me so specifically, more honestly than finding out about the missing trust money, which is objectively the bigger, more serious thing that happened in this story. I think it's because the trust fund was about greed and fear and desperation, emotions I can at least trace a line to and understand, even if I don't excuse them. But the accusation at that dinner was about assumption. It was about deciding you already know someone's whole life, their choices, their worth, based on one incomplete number and a story that was convenient for you to believe. I think that's a particular kind of disrespect that doesn't always get named because it hides behind the shape of just asking questions. It's been just under a year since Bellamy's Steakhouse. Derek and I are still in the house in Nyack. We had Isabel and Holt over for dinner last month, the first time either of them has been to our place since the birthday party, and it was quiet and a little careful, but it was good. Isabel asked, for the first time in 3 years, an actual question about my job, what an actuarial consultant does day to day, what the exams were like, and I don't think she was performing interest. I think she genuinely wanted to know who I was, finally, past the assumptions. Christine and I haven't rebuilt anything close to a friendship. I don't know if we ever will, and I've made peace with that. What we have is something more like a working truce, polite at family events, direct when we need to be, no more performance of closeness than actually exists between us. Derek says that's healthier than the surface-level warmth we used to have anyway, and I think he's right, even if it took losing the surface-level version to get here. I still think about that dinner sometimes, the specific silence after Christine sat down, the way 22 people looked anywhere but at me. I used to replay it wishing I'd said something sharp in the moment, some perfect line that would have shut it down instantly. I don't wish that anymore. I think if I'd fired back that night, it would have just looked like exactly what she'd accused me of, a woman getting defensive because she'd been caught. The silence, as much as it cost me, is what let the real story surface on its own terms, with real documents behind it instead of just my word against hers. If there's a takeaway here, I think it's this. The people who are quickest to accuse you of chasing something usually understand something about chasing things themselves. Not always, not in some tidy, universal law way, but often enough that it's worth remembering the next time someone stands up at a dinner table with a glass in their hand, certain they've caught you in something. That certainty is not the same thing as truth. It just feels that way to the person holding the glass. I don't know if Christine and I will ever be close. I do know that Derek and I are steadier now than we were before any of this happened, in a strange way, not because betrayal makes a marriage stronger. That's a lie people tell to make hard things feel meaningful, but because we went through something genuinely difficult together, and neither of us flinched away from the truth of it, even when the truth was inconvenient for people we loved. My own salary told a different story than the one Christine told that night. But the real story, the one that actually mattered in the end, was never really about money at all. It was about who gets believed, who gets the benefit of the doubt, and how much quiet work it sometimes takes to make sure the truth outlasts the rumor. That's it. That's the whole story. Takeaway. An accusation said with confidence isn't the same thing as an accusation that's true. And the truth, even when it takes months to surface, usually outlasts the rumor that tried to bury it.